History as it happens, October 18th, 2022. The war that never ended.
Kevin Suri was photographed inside the Capitol with a Confederate flag that day. He and his son Hunter were found guilty of obstructing.
The images shocked many Americans, including a descendant of General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate.
I will lay out just some of the evidence proving that we won this election, and we won it by a landslide. This was not.
Let's have trial by combat.
That protest is Peace Circle, breach the line. We need backup.
Wars don't end, they migrate to our minds. And we were reminded of that when a Delaware man carried the Confederate battle flag into the Capitol building to try to stop the steal on January 6. Were the seeds of our current dilemmas planted after the Civil War? Jeremi Suri makes that argument next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Living through the last 6-7 years in our country, it became imperative to me as a historian to try to understand the origins of the divisions we see today, the violence we're experiencing, the anti-democratic behavior. And as I did my research, I found the strongest parallels to this period. Many of the seeds for the issues we're dealing with today were planted in the soil after the Civil War.
Before the riot at the U.S. Capitol, nearly 2 years ago already, I'd bet you never heard of Kevin Suri, a resident of Sussex County, Delaware, in his early 50s. If he ever wished to be famous, he may have second thoughts now. That's because Suri was convicted of a felony, obstructing an official proceeding for climbing through a broken window on January 6, 2021, and marauding through the halls of Congress.
Get back, ladies! Get back, ladies! Unit 21 priority. We just had protest at Peace Circle. Breach the line. We need backup.
Well, Suri may have stayed relatively unknown, just one of hundreds of people charged in that spasm of political violence, had it not been for something he was carrying that day, the Confederate battle flag. A symbol of white supremacy, slavery, secession, treason, the losing side in our bloody Civil War, a conflict that left us much to lament and little to celebrate. And not until I read historian Jeremi Suri's new book, Civil War by Other Means, did I know that in 2004 in Seafried, Sussex County, a group of white residents formed the Delaware Greys. That's a chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And 3 years later, they built their own monument, a granite obelisk with the inscribed names of the 140 Delaware residents who fought for the Confederacy. 2 flags flew above the monument, writes Suri, one with the state's emblem, and the other, nope, not the American flag, the Confederate flag. The Delaware Greys, still fighting the Civil War, not on the battlefield, but in our minds.
And we're dealing with the weaknesses and the problems that were planted from this period after the Civil War all the way today.
My conversation with the historian at the University of Texas at Austin is coming up in a moment. If Kevin Suri and his fellow rioters remind us of the vigilante violence that scarred the southern states after the Civil War, recent arguments before the Supreme Court evoke the political and legal battles of Reconstruction. Alabama Solicitor General Edmund LaCour said to the justices that his state's congressional map did not discriminate against black voters. He argued that racial considerations are inconsistent with the 14th Amendment. And that prompted a history lesson from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
They really just showed sort of broad-based societal discrimination. They didn't show anything wrong with our map, so it cannot be that that is specifically identified discrimination that could justify using race to change our map.
I don't think that the historical record establishes that the founders believed that race neutrality or race blindness was required. Right? They drafted the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which specifically stated that citizens would have the same civil rights as enjoyed by white citizens. That's the point of that act, to make sure that the other citizens, the black citizens, would have the same as the white citizens. So they recognized that there was unequal treatment, that people based on their race were being treated unequally. There was a concern that the Civil Rights Act wouldn't have a constitutional foundation. That's when the 14th Amendment came into play. It was drafted to give a foundational, a constitutional foundation for a piece of legislation that was designed to make people who had less opportunity and less rights equal to white citizens.
The 14th Amendment is a prohibition on discriminatory state action. It is not an obligation to engage in affirmative discrimination in favor of some groups vis-a-vis others.
No, but as the record shows that the reason why the 14th Amendment was enacted was to give a constitutional foundation for that kind of effort, for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was doing what the Section 2 is doing here.
157 years after Appomattox, we Americans are still fighting over the meaning of that new birth of freedom brought about by the Union victory. And we still have this strange relationship with our own democracy, insofar people like Kevin Seafried believe the wrong people are voting, an idea that underpinned the Stop the Steal campaign. For the question that hung over the post-Civil War United States is the same one we're grappling with today. What kind of democracy are we going to be? And that is what inspired Jeremi Suri to write his book, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Jeremi Suri, welcome back to the podcast.
Nice to be on with you, Martin.
On the day your book comes out, Civil War by Other Means. Congrats on the book.
Thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time to read it. I hope many of your listeners will, too.
It is a worthy book. It lands at the right time. But first, I want to start with a minor correction, something you said the last time you were on the podcast. You called me a historian. I'm not a historian. I'm not even an amateur historian, but I like to talk to historians, so.
You're a historian because you take history seriously. That's all. You don't need to have a PhD to be a historian.
Well, I'll take that. I'll go with that. So, to your book, as I mentioned, coming at the right time, although there's really never a bad time to revisit this era, the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction. What inspired you to write about it?
The last 6 to 7 years of our politics, I've written many books on American foreign policy, on the Cold War, on social movements in the 20th century, on nation building. I never thought I'd write a book on the 1870s. But living through the last 6, 7 years in our country, it became imperative to me as a historian to try to understand the origins of the divisions we see today, the violence we're experiencing, the anti-democratic behavior. And as I did my research, I found the strongest parallels to this period. And it also became clear to me, as it was not before I did this research, Martin, that many of the seeds for the issues we're dealing with today were planted in the soil after the Civil War. Many of these seeds were planted in our institutions, such as our voting institutions. And we're dealing with the weaknesses and the problems that were planted from this period after the Civil War all the way today.
So you see continuities there over the last century and a half.
Yes, I see continuities. There are, of course, discontinuities as well, and I try to cover a bit of both, but I see very strong continuities, and voting is the most obvious one of these. After the Civil War, the most important political debate is who gets to vote and how. And boy, oh boy, we're still having that debate. After the Civil War, those who believe the wrong people are voting claim it's fraud. That's what we're experiencing today as well. So I see very strong continuities.
Because you're a careful scholar and you wouldn't say, something that happened 150 years ago caused something that's happening today. But when we look back at our past and we try to find causation or draw a line from one period to the next, I think that's what you're doing here in the book. I mean, that was the sense I got from reading it.
In a certain way, it's impossible for something that happened so long ago to cause a specific action today. That's not what we're talking about here. It's not in the way in which we can say that Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine caused a war. That's a different kind of analysis. But what I am arguing is that decisions that are made in the distant past, that could be even more distant than 150 years ago, they leave an imprint on our institutions, and those imprints affect the ways our institutions operate. It's sort of like family history. Our grandparents are not responsible for our behavior, but they conditioned circumstances that affect the way we have developed as citizens and human beings. And that's the same point I'm making here.
Sometimes issues do remain unresolved, and you ask this question in your book several times. What kind of democracy are we going to be? That question was important in 1865, 1875, and 2022.
Absolutely. And it is unresolved. And it's unresolved because of the Civil War. Coming out of the Civil War, we create avenues for citizenship that were unthinkable for the Founding Fathers. And this is one of the great accomplishments of the Republican Party and the Lincolnian vision, to turn 4 million slaves into citizens, to offer natural-born citizenship in the 14th Amendment. So many roads for inclusion, and those are the bright parts of the story. But these roads to inclusion then raise questions as to how power will be used. And those who hold power, it's not just because of race, it's because of many elements, economic, social. Those who hold power are always very skeptical of new people coming in to challenge their power. And so the fundamental question is, how do we bring new people into our democracy, whether they're immigrants, etc.? How do we bring them into our democracy in a way that expands our democracy but doesn't undermine the authority of those who believe they have a right to authority within our system?
Remember Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln? It ends with a celebratory mood in the U.S. Congress, the passage of the 13th Amendment, get my history right here, to abolish human chattel slavery. That wasn't the end.
Nope, that was just the beginning. And one of the points I make in the book, and it's a point I think that many historians have made, and a point historians should always remind policymakers and citizens of. Wars don't end simply because the two sides on the battlefield leave the battlefield. The war continues. Every European knows this. The wars in Yugoslavia didn't end when Slobodan Milosevic was forced to back down. And the Civil War did not really end at Appomattox. Many of the divisions, many of the debates, and many of the violent conflicts continued. And I show that in the book. Most specifically, there are a lot of people who never actually think they've lost.
They literally did not surrender. We're going to get to some of these really interesting chapters that you opened my eyes to in your book, but a couple more of these larger points about the Civil War not ending. One of my old Ithaca College professors, Paul McBride, now retired, once said to me, "Wars do not end, they migrate to our minds." That is, of course, true of the Civil War, but even more than our minds, in the everyday lives of Americans in a more tangible sense. When the fighting stops in any war, there has to be a just settlement. World War I ended in late 1918. The settlement didn't really settle much. In the United States, I mentioned the Lincoln movie before. We want to come away with the end of the Civil War with a triumphant mood, feeling good about our history. We ended slavery. But the settlement was in many ways unjust.
That's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of work required to create a just settlement. It's not simply the agreements. It's the work done by society to educate people and to, quite frankly, train a new generation to think about things differently, which is why historical teaching is so important. The Germans are, to some extent, a model. Although far from perfect, they have spent now 2 generations thinking about how to teach the Holocaust and how to learn from that history, not to recreate horrible actions in their society. They have tried, in the German term, to pursue Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, to work through their history. That's a classic German word, right? It goes on more than one sentence in length for one word. But what it really is working through your history to create a settlement in the mind, as well as between people in material conditions. We have not done that. In fact, one of the reasons I wrote this book, Martin, is we seem to be going in the opposite direction.
We haven't done enough of it, man.
Yeah, we haven't done enough of it, and we often want to pretend the war ended and tell a triumphal story, and there are things to be proud of.
Absolutely.
Without talking about the lingering issues that we have to work through, and inequality is, of course, one of them.
No, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were wonderful. The problem was they were usurped. Well, not the 13th Amendment. Speaking of history, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson steeped her remarks to the Alabama Solicitor General in history. She talked about how the 14th and 15th Amendments were not race blind, as Alabama tries to gut what's left of the Voting Rights Act.
That's absolutely right. And I listened to the recording we had of her questions and comments, and she's spot on that, in fact, this was the opposite of a race-blind discussion at the time. It was very keyed to the questions of which races would have control in which moments. And it's so important also to understand the issue of enforcement, which he was also getting at. Just because something is made a constitutional amendment doesn't mean it is enforced as such. Our federal system, lowercase f, gives a lot of authority to the states, and even more so in the 1870s than today, when there were very few instruments for federal enforcement.
You must be reading my mind. I was just going to ask you that, a point you make in your book time and again. The mechanisms were not there. So think of the federal bureaucracy. Well, there was none. Think of the federal government before the Civil War. What was the largest agency or grouping, if you will? The U.S. Army, and it was up to the Army to have to enforce a just settlement, if you will, force Southerners to abide by the new laws in Congress and the constitutional amendments. So there were civil rights acts in Congress and then the amendments to the Constitution. You point out how the federal judiciary was kind of small. It was weak. It had no way to enforce. There was no real national police force. There wasn't an FBI yet, etc. I'll let you take it from here.
And Ulysses Grant tries to fix some of this. So as president, Ulysses Grant creates the Justice Department. A lot of people don't know that. There's no Justice Department in the Constitution, just an Attorney General. Ulysses Grant creates the Justice Department, and its primary job is to enforce the amendments and other legislation in the states. He also tries to get the U.S. Army to put more into enforcement, to create actually military tribunals to supersede the civil tribunals in many states that are not prosecuting people for attacking African American communities and things of that sort. But the problem is, even within the Republican Party, there's opposition to doing this because it costs a lot of money.
The deference to local control, time and again, was on the wrong side of these issues.
This is an important point. When people say local control and states' rights, they rarely mean actually giving more local control. They mean the ability of local areas to not follow federal laws in certain moments. Many of those who argue in the 1870s for local control, like those today, actually want more federal government in some areas. They want more federal subsidies, and they want less federal enforcement of the law.
Yeah, states' rights was a means to an end.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It was less a hardened principle. One more big point here before we start diving into the details of the book. I am glad that you chose this period in our country, because I'll make a point that I've made in previous episodes, and I'll have you respond to it. All the hand-wringing about fascism in America today, in my view, is misguided. We are not seeing a fascist revolution in our country. Actual fascists are a relatively minor problem. It's not that they don't exist. Instead of looking to Europe in the 1930s for historical guidance and, the fall of the Weimar Republic and all that, we can look to our own history and find stories about how a multiracial democracy can be attacked and hollowed out. Fascism is a revolutionary movement that seeks to end democracy. There was still democracy in the South, but it was a perverted, hollowed-out form of democracy that excluded black people.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think fascism generally involves a coherent political program for national greatness. That's what one thinks about in German and Italian fascism. I don't think that the right-wing extremism in the United States has a program for national greatness. They might use that language. But as you say, what they are really pursuing is a hollowed-out democracy, a democracy for a select few and the exclusion of others. And that has a long tradition in our society that is separate from the history of European fascism. I agree 100%.
So as I read your book, I kept thinking of January 6, at least the early chapters, the introduction and the initial chapter about John Wilkes Booth. Was that your purpose?
Yes. So I start the book with January 6th. I focus on Kevin Seafried, who's the gentleman who carries the Confederate flag into the Capitol, and also what still I find extraordinary, Martin, the building of a gallows on the Mall in front of the Capitol. How could we not believe that there's a historical reference that the January 6th insurrectionists are making? But then from there, the book leaves January 6th and goes back to Lincoln's assassination.
John Wilkes Booth. I have to say, I don't know a lot about John Wilkes Booth other than the basics we're taught as kids. I've never really read much about him, or if I have, I can't remember it. You start the book with a chapter about him and the assassination, and not just Lincoln's assassination, which changed the course of U.S. history, but also as a symbol of a certain kind of democracy, a perverse rendering of it. But Booth saw himself as a hero and a patriot.
And to my astonishment, doing the research, I didn't know this before I did the research, he's seen as a hero by millions of Americans, particularly in the South. I spent a lot of time, as you've seen reading the book, looking at newspapers in states like Texas. It's extraordinary. They see him as a hero. They see him slaying the tyrant as he saw himself.
They didn't necessarily agree with his methods, but they still hailed him as a symbol.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, they saw him as a tragic hero.
It's disturbing. I remember being disturbed reading that chapter about some of the things that were said about Booth. Reminded me to the mixed reaction based on section of the country to what John Brown did. John Brown's terrorist attack on the Harper's Ferry Armory and his attempt to ignite a slave revolt. I'm not saying Booth and Brown are the same person, but you get my point.
Right, the valorization or the apology for extreme violence. What's really extraordinary about this is not only that people at the time revere Booth in particular parts of the country, Martin, it's that continues for a long time. I talk about this in one of the chapters. His body is eventually moved to the most elite cemetery in Baltimore. And if you look at Baltimore newspapers through the 19th century, people are going every day to lay flowers at his grave.
The initial shock wears off after Lincoln's assassination, and then people start retreating to their corners. I was naive after January 6th. I said, that's it. That's the final straw. We're going to finally unite as a country and put this awful chapter of our history behind us. Well, how naive I was.
Right. You would have thought the assassination of a president would be exactly the same thing, too.
So, Jeremy, another area of history I admit to knowing very little about until I read your book, the Confederate exiles. I mentioned earlier in our conversation about how there were some people who literally did not surrender after Appomattox. They went to Mexico. Who were these people and why Mexico?
This is at least 50,000 Confederate soldiers and officers, and there are even more who go to Brazil, by the way. I focus in the book on those who go to Mexico. These are often very high-ranking officers in the Confederate Army, Joseph Shelby, John Bankhead Magruder. They have these wonderful names. And at the end of the war, they decide they're not done. They're not going to surrender. They give their soldiers the choice to go back home to their farms or to march with them to Mexico. And many of them march with their commanders to Mexico. And they join up with this horrible figure, Maximilian I, who is an emperor of Mexico installed by Louis Napoleon, and Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, who, as French now self-proclaimed empire, is trying to reclaim the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere. Maximilian is fighting a civil war for control of Mexico. He's fighting against Benito Juarez, who was a local revolutionary who modeled his program on Lincoln. He and Lincoln actually, they have correspondence. They're pretty close to one another. So it's a continuation of the Civil War in Mexico. These Confederates also bring their slaves. Mexico does not have slavery, but Mexico allows them to create 20-year labor contracts where these former slaves now have to work without pay.
Yeah. In a sense, they wanted to colonize Mexico.
That's exactly right. They wanted to colonize Mexico, and that's how it's sold. They actually offer land, Maximilian does, to these individuals. They create a whole town called Carlotta, named for Maximilian's wife. And here's the thing, Martin. They not only go to Mexico, they join Maximilian's army, which is the definition of treason, joining a foreign army. They fight for Maximilian. And then when Maximilian is defeated and killed, they return to the United States, all of them, and proclaim themselves heroes and end up taking, and this is the most depressing part of this, they end up taking powerful positions in the United States within the Democratic Party. One of them, Alexander Watkins Terrell, many people might have heard of him, he becomes a major figure in the Texas legislature. He will write and pass the legislation to create the University of Texas, my institution, but also the Texas voting laws. So just think about that. A Confederate leader who leaves the country, goes and fights for a foreign army against the United States to defend slavery, comes back and creates the voting laws in one of our largest states, voting laws that remain on the books till the 1960s. Terrell also created what was known as the white primary. In Texas, non-whites were not allowed to vote in the primary, the Democratic primary, until 1944.
Amazing. Well, they also wanted to bring slavery back to the United States, and that they failed.
Right. Their goal was to fight for Mexico, to defeat the Union again, to try again, and then to reinscribe slavery within the United States. This was their effort.
So I've read my Eric Foner, among others, so I was familiar with the next part of your book where you talk about what happens after the Civil War and how former Confederates, whether they were in Mexico or not, try to reestablish the status quo, minus slavery. but pretty much everything else, right? They wanted to essentially chain black people, freed black people, to farms, to plantations. They didn't want to deny them civil rights, any kind of rights. And that project fails at first because of not only the work of the radical Republicans in Congress, also because of the work of brave black people who were able to run for office and vote. And they rewrote the state constitutions of the former Confederate states. You know, and Eric Foner was on the podcast some months ago. He reminded me, when you're talking about the South after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, it's not the old South, it's a new South, responsible for the composition of these states once they rejoin the Union. What does Jeremi Suri have to say about that?
I think Eric's absolutely right. And what I think I can add to that story is for us to appreciate how contested this moment is. Going through the sources myself, what I was struck with is that you really have a continuation of the battles from the Civil War as these African American communities are struggling with amazing courage to vote, to participate, to send members to Congress and state legislatures, to acquire land. And I talk about a lot of this in the book. Many of them are veterans of the Union Army. So they were slaves who were brought into the Union Army, taught to read and write. They now have a sense of purpose and self-confidence and skills that they're using to establish themselves. But they are continuing to fight from day one against entrenched communities that are trying to hold on to their power. And I don't think it's just race, Martin. It's what Richard Hofstadter talked about more than 50 years ago. It's status. It's the desire for people who have held status, white communities, even poor white communities, not to lose their status to new competition from these African American and immigrant communities and various others. So this is one of the ways in which the Civil War is continuing far away from the traditional battlefields.
Yeah, there was a massacre, right? I believe in Memphis.
Memphis in 1866, and it's horrible.
Horrendous.
I should say one of the reasons we have good material on some of these horrible activities is because of congressional investigations conducted by radical Republicans. They didn't lead in many cases to legislation, but they collected testimony. So you can read the testimony from the victims, the survivors. In the case of Memphis, this is a community of sheriffs, local police, local business owners who decide that they are going to take the law into their own hands. You see that phrase quite often. And they are going to literally massacre the free African American community in Memphis. Rapes, stealing of money, possessions, true terror brought to them. And the idea is not simply to put that community down, it's to intimidate anyone from challenging white power in their communities.
I think what happened in Memphis was freed black people had gotten together in a meeting, public meeting, to organize, talk about what they wanted to do as a community, and they're basically attacked and murdered.
The very act of their meeting and trying to establish political power was seen as deeply threatening and crossing a line. And for the white citizens of Memphis, this was urgent because there was such a large community of free African Americans, and the white community was concerned that they were going to lose, under a more expansive democracy, they would lose their control of their community. This is about community control, Martin.
And to our earlier point about the mechanisms to enforce the law, protect African American people so they could, let alone vote, just live in peace. At this very tense, fraught moment, Grant, he had been hesitant to impose martial law, military rule, but I think the Memphis massacre, as you relate it in your book, was a turning point for him.
And this fits with, I think, an emerging historiography on Ulysses Grant in the last 10 years. It used to be that Grant was seen as a great general in the Civil War, and then his career goes downhill from there. I think that's not true. And I'm with a new group of historians who I think when you look at Grant's papers, you find that this man has a true transformation. He goes from someone who had a pretty negative view of African Americans and others before and early in the Civil War to someone who's come after the Civil War, particularly after the Memphis massacre, to see them not only as victims, but as a population that is equal or near equal to whites and deserves more protection and more help. And that transformation is crucial.
I think you saw my notes prior to this interview because I was going to ask you about Grant and the changing historiography. I want to return to Grant, that subject, when we get to Grant's presidency a little bit later. It's okay if we bounce around, though. It's hard to maintain a strict chronology here. But the Memphis Massacre, 1866. So Grant's not president yet. He's still in charge of the Army at that point.
He's commander of the Union Army, and it's really interesting, and I talk about this in the book, of course. He's working very closely with Congress because the Republicans in Congress, and they control everything. They have a 2/3 vote in the Senate, but nonetheless, they don't control the presidency because Andrew Johnson has succeeded Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. And so Congress is really trying to work through Grant to enforce the federal laws and amendments that Andrew Johnson is not enforcing.
We already talked about how in the South, these communities wanted to jealously defend their interests, white supremacy, among other things. They maliciously sought to maintain the status quo. But in the North and other parts of the country and in the West, there was also a lack of energy. There was an exhaustion that had set in after the war. And the will to impose a just outcome on the South was also lacking.
And Martin, this is again where historians have a lot to offer policymakers and citizens. Because we put so much into winning wars, usually by the end of the traditional battles, we want to go home. This is how our system is set up, right? Temporary mobilization, and then we go back to what we think is normal. The problem with that, we see that after World War I, as we do after the Civil War, is that much of the hard work remains to be done. Northerners who had sacrificed so much within their families, within their economy for the war, they want to move on. They want to be done with this. There are far better opportunities for Northern capital in westward expansion, in the railroads and other new economic developments in the West. The South is not where the money is, and the South is difficult and brings out more of the issues that the Northerners want to get beyond. And my message in the book, Martin, is you can't just move on when the war is done. If you really care about it, you cannot move on.
It's so tough because, we need to reconcile. We were a country again. We were, well, not quite. We hadn't reconstructed the South yet. But you know what I mean. We're all Americans, and there was some sympathy for the South. I mean, their lives had been destroyed. Now, of course, they brought that upon themselves. And there was also a myth already taking root in the South that they didn't actually lose.
Of course. And the third thing I'd add to that is there were many Northerners who themselves weren't sure they really wanted full African-American participation. What's interesting, and I talk about this in the book, is many of the Northern senators wanted African-Americans to vote in the South because they knew they'd vote Republican, but they didn't want them to vote in Ohio and Illinois because they weren't sure how they would vote in Ohio and Illinois.
So impersonal historical forces, there's a lot of that in your book, but also we can't forget individuals and bad luck, whatever you might call it, agency, human agency, you're the historian here, not me, can change the course of events. Lincoln is shot, and his vice president is regrettable Andrew Johnson, and he had he fought Congress. I mean, this makes up a large part of the middle of your book. In order to impose a just settlement on the South and allow black people to live freely and enjoy civil rights, the radical Republicans in Congress wanted to do that. Grant wanted to do that to a certain degree, but you had a president who did not, and this was an epic battle.
Andrew Johnson, for his first 8 months or so as president, is virtual dictator because he becomes president in April of 1865 after Lincoln's assassination. Congress doesn't sit until December, and he has all war powers. And he uses these war powers then and later to, among other things, pardon Confederates, pardon treasonous actors, which allows them to come back into the system and reassert their power. These criminals now become powerful figures because of Johnson. He vetoes legislation when he can, and he just doesn't enforce the law. And Congress has to find ways around this. And here's one of the important points that comes out of this. Congress has to empower the military in some ways to act in ways that the executive doesn't want the military to act. And that's what happens with Ulysses Grant.
Yeah, I'm not sure Congress was on sound constitutional footing here. I mean, they basically prevented Johnson from even dealing with his own cabinet.
That's correct. And that's what makes the impeachment issue so complicated, right? There were many issues to impeach Johnson on. The one they went after was that he violated the Tenure of Office Act, which had prohibited him from firing his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who was the one Congress was working with to use Ulysses Grant and the military to actually enforce the laws, despite the president. The point here that needs to be made, Martin, is that our system of federalism and our system of checks and balances, which looks good when you read Montesquieu and you read the Constitution, it is more than messy. It becomes contradictory, and it becomes a spaghetti bowl of contradictions between different institutions.
Well, the Constitution is written vaguely.
That's exactly right, and it's exploitable by someone like an Andrew Johnson who doesn't want to enforce the law. There are actually very few ways to force the president to do his job. Andrew Johnson was not doing his job. Congress then had to find unconstitutional or potentially unconstitutional means of getting around a recalcitrant president. I don't think that's the last time we had that issue.
Well, you mentioned before a quirk in our system that doesn't exist anymore. The elections were in November, but the new Congress wasn't seated until the following December, so 13 months after being elected.
And you had this long interregnum between the November election and March when the president was inaugurated, and then you had this long interregnum between then and the new Congress being seated. And particularly during wartime, this gave enormous power to the president. That was a good thing if you were as a Union supporter when Lincoln was president, a bad thing when Andrew Johnson was president.
Well, the tables were turned there. Suddenly, the imperious Johnson was an ally of the South, whereas the imperious Lincoln was a tyrant.
And it should be said that Johnson was clever. He was diabolical. He was drunk. There were a lot of things to say about him, but he was clever. One of the arguments he made that actually is sensible, even though it's diabolical, is that since Lincoln had the power to declare that these states had seceded, that they were in rebellion, I, as president, Johnson said, have the power to bring them back in. I don't need Congress. Congress is trying to set conditions for the states, as it did. You had to ratify the amendments in your state constitution, et cetera, et cetera. Johnson said, no, Lincoln didn't have to go through Congress to say these states were in rebellion. Now I don't have to go through Congress to bring them back in. Both Lincoln and Johnson were probably on weak constitutional ground, but Lincoln had created a diabolical precedent that Johnson was able to try to exploit.
What do they call it? The imperial presidency? It didn't exist in the 1860s. It exists today, but maybe we'll return to that at the end of the conversation. I want to talk about the impeachment saga, but a couple more points about Johnson's presidency prior to the impeachment battle. He was opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, right? So he didn't want to enforce that.
Correct.
And then 14th Amendment passed by the Senate, 1866, ratified 2 years later. July of 1868, so Johnson is still president. He opposed, I am assuming, the 14th Amendment as well?
Yes, he did. He opposed any measure that interfered with what he saw as the state's prerogatives with regard to civil rights and the treatment of citizens.
So this is what he and Congress were fighting over, Civil Rights Act and this other stuff.
Absolutely. It's the Civil Rights Act he vetoes and does everything he can to prevent it from being enforced, and Congress overrides his veto and then goes to grant, and it is in the enforcement acts that follow the Civil Rights Act that Congress creates 10 military districts in the South that are not the same as the state lines, with military authority in them superseding political authority. Again, this is all constitutionally questionable, but it puts the military in charge of what are in essence 10 occupied zones in the South.
What other means did they have at their disposal, right? We talked about that.
That's exactly right. And they create, it's extraordinary, they create military tribunals, which will supersede civil tribunals. So you could be, this is the basis for some of our federal civil rights enforcement today, right? You can be acquitted in a state or a district court, but then you will still be subjected to trial in a military court.
And you brought something up here in your book that I never thought of before. In terms of math, it's easier to impeach a president, in terms of the math, than it is to override a veto, because you need a supermajority in both houses to override a veto, whereas to impeach a president in the House, you only need a simple majority, supermajority in the Senate. So the idea was this president is vetoing so much legislation, he actually deserves to be impeached.
Precisely. This is why the override of a veto, which occurs relatively rarely, is really dangerous for a president, because it means the votes are potentially there to kick you out. Andrew Jackson, who of course had his own wars with Congress, was very careful to make sure he had enough votes so he wouldn't be in the end impeached. Johnson was not, and he's impeached and almost convicted, if not for, as I describe in the book, a sort of corrupt bribery at the very last minute.
So we'll talk about impeachment now. I think all of us agree, historians on the left, center, and right, and Americans who've looked into this, that Andrew Johnson was a terrible president. He was a ferocious white supremacist. He just was unsuited for that office. But when it came to impeaching Johnson, and this really resonated with me, the way you related this chapter of our history, because we've been through several impeachment dramas in the last couple of years. What I took away from this is that impeachment, and no offense to the founding fathers, is a very poor tool for reining in a rogue executive, isn't it?
I think that has to be the lesson, Martin, because you couldn't have a clearer case than Andrew Johnson for someone, and you couldn't have a clearer case where one party, the party that wanted to convict Johnson, had the votes. They had 2/3 in the Senate. But the problem is this system means that you're telling senators they have to kick out the person the voters ostensibly chose, and then they have to choose the replacement. And that's the real problem, because members of the Senate will not do that. Benjamin Wade, who is the Senate pro tempore, he's the former governor and then senator from Ohio, he's a radical Republican. He's the next in line. Conservative Republicans don't want him in there. And that's the problem that you fall into. We have never successfully been able to convict a president who broke the law while that president is in office, and the system doesn't allow it.
Well, what's a high crime and misdemeanor?
That's part of the issue. What's a high crime and misdemeanor? But also, how are you going to line up the politics, even when one party is in control?
Well, there's the notion that it's too radical a step, even for a bad president. I mean, obviously, it mentions treason and bribery, I think, are the two other things in there. But a high crime and misdemeanor, that often is, you did something I disapprove of.
No, and in the end, it's usually safer for members of the Senate not to convict. This is a problem. I'm not saying that we should be willy-nilly convicting and kicking presidents out. That would be terrible too. But I am saying that if we believe, as I think we all believe, that there should be some line, that if a chief executive crosses that line, they should be removed, we really don't have a process for that. And I can't ever foresee that happening. I don't imagine in our lifetimes, Martin, we will see a president convicted and thrown out of office under the current system.
To remove a president from office after he's been elected, you're basically telling voters, sorry, we're undoing the election here.
Correct. And that's why many of them won't do it. And I worry, even with subsequent amendments, which create a process through which the vice president, in theory, can initiate a mechanism for removing a mentally unsound president. But I worry, as we age as a population and we have more people with mental issues that come on very quickly, we've all seen that, unfortunately, in our families, we don't have a mechanism there either.
Donald Trump incited a mob or egged on a mob that then went and attacked another branch of government while he went and watched it on television, and he couldn't even be convicted for that.
That's right.
And at that point, it may have been academic, so to speak, but no. I mean, it sends an important message about future conduct in that office.
I completely agree.
I think we discussed this about Nixon last time you were on, about the pardon. When Ford decided to pardon Nixon, it set a really bad precedent. We don't know how to deal with this problem in our country. I mean, our founders had an idea. I thought they were spot on about the dangers, right, of a rogue executive. But how to deal with it, I mean, I don't know. Don't come to me for answers, Jeremy.
Well, but it is interesting that this is really our first case with Andrew Johnson. And I think the system fails in this sense. And that doesn't mean that we don't get through that. Obviously, we get through it.
He was discredited and weakened by it, right?
And he didn't run again.
Well, that was good, yeah. Well, he would have won.
Yeah, but that's the point. This is something that I refer to in the book and deserves even more attention. The tradition of the party making certain that you had someone who ran who they felt was at least qualified. That's a really important precedent that we lost. At the end of the book, when James Garfield is assassinated and Chester Arthur replaces him, we have another completely unqualified person who's become president, and there's no chance Arthur can run again. His own party won't allow it. The smoke-filled party politics of the 19th century were corrupt, but at least they believed you had to be capable of doing the job if you were going to run again.
The primary system has changed that. I should point out, of course, Andrew Johnson wasn't really elected. I mean, he was the vice president. He was on the ticket. But even so, it was still a step too far for moderate Republicans. And who knows what would have happened had Johnson been removed from office because, as you said, a name that's lost the history, Benjamin Wade. I mean, he may have caused an even greater backlash in the South. I mean, who knows? I don't want to get into counter.
Or the opposite. Some would argue that Benjamin Wade was part of a radical, what we would today call progressive wing of a party that actually would have taken more action. We don't know. It is true, though, that Benjamin Wade had a lot of enemies.
And you, Jeremi Suri, believe that Johnson should have been removed?
Yes. I think we need to think about presidential succession in new ways. Again, the founders didn't expect that people would try to assassinate presidents or that presidents would be in office when they were so old that they were likely to die in office. It rarely happened until Lincoln. From Lincoln's presidency through the end of the 19th century, those 35, 36 years, we have 3 assassinations. Lincoln and Garfield, the 2 bookends for my book, and then, of course, McKinley in 1901. And our succession system is terrible. In the cases of Lincoln and Garfield's assassinations, we have 2 people, Johnson and Arthur, who become president with more than 3 years left in the term, who are not qualified, were only on the ticket to appease certain political groups. They were not there because they had any basis for being president. No one voted for them to be in that role, and they served for more than 3 years. I argue we should at least create a system where if you succeed a slain president or a removed president within the first 2 years of his term, at that 2-year mark, at the midterm, there should be another election for a short term for president.
Wow. Well, we'd have to amend the Constitution for that, so forget about it. But it's not a bad idea.
Don't you think it makes sense?
Yeah, well,
we do that for senators.
Yeah.
I mean, so, Ben Sass is going to resign as senator from Nebraska. The governor will appoint someone, but that person doesn't get a 6-year term. They will just do 2 years.
Well, the only role of the vice president is to be there if something happens to the president. The vice president has no power.
And break a tie in the Senate.
Break a tie, that's right. Thank you. I like to fail my civics tests here on my podcast quite frequently.
But your point is well taken, right? This is John Nance Garner's statement, former Speaker of the House, who is Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president for the first 2 terms, from Uvalde, Texas, actually. And John Nance Garner said that the office of president wasn't worth a bucket of, and I'll let you fill in the rest of that sentence, because you're right. The president's supposed to stand around and be ready, but do nothing.
Vice president, yeah.
The vice president, the vice president.
Reconstruction. There were some real advances and successes in Reconstruction. Why ultimately did it collapse or fail? Or who destroyed it? It just didn't collapse on its own. Sets our country back a century.
So I think it's 2 things that lead Reconstruction to not reach the success it should have. But it does achieve many things, as you said. But the 2 things are resistance in the South, violent resistance, and a lack of will, a lack of determination, a lack of commitment in the North. It's the combination of those 2 things. You have a resistant, weakened South, but a South that is determined to resist in many areas. And then you have Northern Republicans who have resources, but they just don't want to prioritize this anymore. And I think my takeaway message that we as historians can offer to others is to say, when the war is over, do not expect the resistance to be gone. Don't expect that once you've arrived in Baghdad that the resistance is going to disappear because the army's disappeared. No, the resistance will still be there. And you better make sure that you're committed to doing what you're doing with 100% effort, because otherwise the resistance will wear you down, and that's what happens.
And what a subversion of democracy, because in some places, the black population overwhelmed the white population. And that's that's how you get the first generation of black lawmakers in this country at the federal and state level.
And here I'll echo Eric Foner, who we talked about before, who really pointed out years ago, correctly, that we have more African Americans elected to office in the late 1860s than we would have again until the 1960s.
There's a theme that runs through your book, and that is the bravery and the resilience of African Americans to fight against this terrible system of oppression.
And not just African Americans, but also white Republicans who support them. There are many. And I think that
the anti-racist of their time.
Correct. And that's also important. We have to do a better job in any period of supporting the good guys one way or another. And one thing that stands in the way quite often is not just the lack of will, but often ignorance. And I do think that's why we teach history, so people will understand that there are groups that are playing such an important role. And those stories need to be told better.
Well, it's presentism. Looking back on some of these Republicans in the 1860s and 1870s who weren't pure. They were on the right side of the issue, and they went about as far as you can expect any white person to go during that period of time.
I think that's true for many of them. I think that's right. The tragedy is that there were many who didn't do that, who turned away.
Will we ever fully bury the Confederacy?
I think we have the chance to now. That's why I'm optimistic. It's one of the reasons I wrote this book. These are seeds that are planted in our society. We can get them out. A couple of things we can do. First of all, we can tell this history so people can't valorize the Confederacy. It's okay to be proud of your ancestors who fought on one side or another. It's okay to say there's something different about your part of the country, wherever that is, for whatever reason. But it's not okay to say that this regime was somehow a regime that could have brought an alternative, better America. That's nonsense. And we don't revere the Confederacy as some alternative. And we shouldn't be hanging those flags, especially in government buildings.
It's a flag of treason.
I think I'm a Jew. I feel it's in the same genre as hanging a swastika. I really.
Well, you don't
think
go to
that.
Germany today and see soldiers from the Third Reich statues that would have a plaque that says maybe the cause wasn't so great, but he fought bravely. No, you don't see that in Germany today.
Exactly. And that's how you bury the Confederacy. You don't ignore the history. In fact, you do the opposite. You double down on studying that history and make sure people understand. You can say it's tragic. You can say these were good men who went wrong. It's fine. You don't have to condemn them morally, but we should recognize that their historical legacy is a legacy that does not deserve reverence or worship of any kind.
When you say good men who went the wrong path, you're talking about the ordinary, average Southern farmer, maybe wasn't even a slaveholder, not the leaders of the Confederacy.
Right. I'm talking about those who, and we see this in any period, those who get pulled into a set of behaviors because all of their short-term incentives follow that. That doesn't apologize for their crimes, but it does mean they're different from those at the very top of the hierarchy who are making specific decisions about life and death and secession and those sorts of issues. So the exiles, those who left and took their soldiers and went to Mexico, they should be criminally responsible for that, in my mind. But many of their soldiers, they shouldn't be valorized for that, but I understand how they often maybe didn't have as much choice as we might think they had in that moment.
This raises an issue. We discussed this a little bit before about how to reintegrate, especially if one side doesn't really want to come to terms with what it's done. And the Confederacy's cause was not noble. Its leaders were traitors. They were racist bastards, if you don't mind me saying. Jefferson Davis is a despicable figure, but at the same time, we're Americans, right? And what happened after World War II in Germany? The Allies initially wanted to purge all Nazis from the bureaucracy, from civil society. And then they realized, well, then we can't have judges, police officers, etc., etc. So many people were Nazi party members.
This is the complexity, right? But there's a lot in between just allowing people to come back and take power, which is what happens in the 1870s, and completely purging a society. And I think the way to do that is to place limits on those who did certain things, like a Jeff Davis, the limits of kinds of power they can have access to, allowing everyone to come back and have a chance and an opportunity, but convicting those who committed crimes and making sure that your new leadership at all levels does not reflect the worst of the regime that you've just defeated. It's a middle position, but it's possible.
Jefferson Davis was unrepentant to the end. He wrote a turgid, I think it was 2 volumes, about the Confederacy. I leafed through that book in a museum once, or a library at a museum once, where he, sets the groundwork for the lost cause myth. He wasn't the only one, of course, but I mean, they won the history wars, the Confederates. We're still overturning them.
To some extent, yeah.
Wow. Sam Harris, one of my favorite public intellectuals, has said we have 2 choices, conversation or war. When the war ends, and the war did end in 1865, we needed to have a conversation. We're still having that conversation. Today we're having that conversation.
Well, and that's the point, and that can actually have enormous value. What I am reacting against, Martin, is those who say we shouldn't talk about this anymore.
Yeah,
we should only tell certain parts of the story. No, I think the most patriotic act is to say, as I do, that I love my country and I love it so much, I want to hold it to its highest ideals. And I want to point out where we haven't lived to those ideas.
Usually my least favorite parts of history books or any books are the suggestions at the end. But I liked yours. You talk, or challenges. You're talking about areas, and we started our conversation off with this. What lines can we draw? What issues are still unresolved from that period? You talk about how, well, we're still having issues with voting. We've always had this strange relationship to democracy and voting in our country. Well, there's too much of it. Right? It's kind of strange, right? And this came up during the Cold War, right? I mean, the Soviets used to point at Jim Crow and the oppression of blacks to say, who are you to wave your finger at the rest of the world? Go ahead.
Well, this is the irony. I mean, we're the greatest democracy in the world, we think, and maybe we are. We have a protection that I revere in the First Amendment for free speech. We don't have a similar protection for voting. By some interpretations, we have more protections for guns than we do for voting. I believe, I argue this at the end of the book, and this was talked about in the 1860s and 70s, we need a constitutional amendment that every citizen above the age 18, if that's where we want to set it, gets the right to vote, full stop.
Yeah, it's never been that explicit or express in the Constitution or the amendments.
And that allows states to play around with this, and not just on one side. Texas makes it hard for people to vote of certain kinds, and here in Texas, I could talk about the details if anyone's interested, but so does New York in its own way. Voter registration laws, all kinds of things that are done to make it hard. Those who have already served their time, who are former felons, not being able to vote, all sorts of things like that. You can't tell someone they can't speak freely because they were a felon, but you can tell them they can't vote because they were a felon even after they've served their time. This makes no sense at all. We should have a constitutional amendment so that everyone has the right to vote. Many people think we already have this, and we don't.
You also mentioned the Electoral College near the end in your chapter about representation.
Get rid of it.
Yes.
Get rid of it.
Oh, let's be realistic. We know that's not going to happen.
Well, that might be true, Martin, but we can't be despondent when we see there's a problem, right?
Well, I don't like the Electoral College either, but
it is a cancerous tumor in our system. We see this in 1876. We didn't have a chance to talk about it. There's an election where Samuel Tilden from New York wins more popular votes. And we have a dispute, and the Electoral College becomes the source of a months-long dispute. And we never really get that resolved. To this day, we don't know who won that election because of the vagaries of the Electoral College, even though we know who had the popular vote. We need to have a system where the person chosen as president is the person who had the most votes, full stop. It doesn't mean we have to go full popular vote, but the current Electoral College sets us up for disaster every single election, where you could have someone who could win as many as 12 million more votes than the other side and lose the Electoral College.
Yeah, there's been an analysis of this. What are the possibilities? And I think you're right. It's like you can lose by 10 or 12 million votes and still somehow eke out the way it is right now.
So we need to talk about it. We're not going to change it tomorrow, obviously, but I'll tell you this, Martin. I'm yet to find an undergraduate who, A, understands Electoral College and thinks it's a good idea.
Well, there's still a debate over why it was even placed in the Constitution. My understanding is it was a check on democracy. Of course, the electorate in those days was tiny. I think the number of people who voted in the election of 1800 was something like 30,000 people. It was tiny. But common folks couldn't be trusted not to be swayed by demagogues. And the Electoral College was placed as a check on that. You know, the irony, of course, is that without the Electoral College, Donald Trump would never have been president.
That's correct.
We're talking about demagogues and things like that. Go ahead.
Nor would George W. Bush in 2000, but nor would Benjamin Harrison, right? I mean, so it's been a problem repeatedly. I will say the Electoral College partially existed also, was put in the Constitution, as you know, because they couldn't figure out a way to elect a president. They didn't actually want the people to choose the president, but they were afraid that if you left it to the states as states, that each state would nominate what they call the favorite son, and then no one would actually, there'd be no consensus. So it was a way of trying to create a consensus. But they really were not trying to create popular election of a president. But we all believe in popular election of a president now, so let's create or recreate the system to make that possible.
Yeah, my explanation of the Electoral College was incomplete. Well, what's really amazing, I read Gordon Wood's book, Empire of Liberty, about the early period. He talks about how in the election of 1796, no one knew what to really do because Washington was stepping aside after 2 terms. So it would be the first election, and no one really knew how to go about it or how to handle it.
That's exactly right. I mean, the first 2 elections are not really elections because they're foregone conclusions that Washington is going to be president.
Yeah. So we're bouncing all over the place here. Let's return to the final point you make in your book, because this also resonated with me. It's a point I've been making on my podcast a lot lately about how we define democracy and the threats to it. You talk about the importance of hearts and minds. One issue I have with the current debate and all the hand-wringing, and I think it's justified to a large degree, about what's happening in our country, is that we look at democracy purely in political terms. Free and fair elections, being able to vote, of course that's critical, right? But there are other pillars of democracy and living in a politically pluralistic society that are also under attack. Social and cultural values of free expression, artistic freedom, academic freedom, freedom of association, and I think on both sides of the spectrum, if you will, on the left and right, we're having a problem here, that our society is becoming less tolerant, less open to conversation. So, I mean, that's kind of more of a speech than a question, but what are your thoughts on the many different threats to democracy, not just in terms of elections?
I think you're right. For the most part, I think that democracy depends upon a culture that embraces democracy. That's what we're saying. And that includes, as you say, conversation. It includes free speech. It includes fundamentally a willingness to look at your values and assess them with a cold-hearted view of one's realistic experiences as well, right? To compare reality with the ideals and not to let the ideals and the ideology define the reality. So that's another way of saying there has to be some truth test to what you're doing as a society. And when I talk about hearts and minds at the end of the book, I think that it's more important than ever that we build conversations around the uncomfortable parts of our history. I want to go the opposite direction from those who say, oh, we shouldn't trash our past. We should tell the story of all the great things we've done. Look, I'm a believer that our society has done some extraordinary things. I'm the child of immigrants. I revere our country. I love our country. I study the history of our country because I love our country. But in the same way I approach my children, I approach my country. I love you so much. I'm going to hold you to the highest ideals. And those are conversations we can have in a productive, non-guilty, non-accusatory way. We can talk about the ways we have not lived up to our values, and we certainly did not after the Civil War, the ways in which those experiences continue to influence us today, and how we can come together to do better. My book is not about accusing people, pointing the finger at anyone. It's about a history we've inherited, just like our family histories that have skeletons in the closet. Let's address those issues and let's work together to see how we can do better going forward. I think that's an agenda for conversation and bringing hearts and minds together.
Well, I like your approach to history. You're not acting as judge and jury. You're analyzing the past and conversing with the past. I mean, there's conversation between individuals, but each of us as individuals can converse with our past, whether it's reading books that we're not familiar with, going to museums, going to where I just was, Mount Vernon, taking in George Washington, warts and all.
Exactly. And I think we can all find inspiration in that. So we can look to a period such as the one after the Civil War, which is an ugly period, and we can say, look at all the efforts made by courageous white Republicans, by courageous African Americans, and let's see why they didn't succeed. And let's see how we can take inspiration to do better in our world. It's less about judging, and it's much more about learning about the fullness and full potential of the human experience, the full potential of a democratic society.
Jeremi Suri, congrats on your book, Civil War by Other Means.
Thank you, Martin. I've enjoyed speaking with you as always.
And I'll just add one more note. By the time this podcast is published, October 18th, the day your book comes out, if I'm not mistaken, my Jets will have already played your Packers. So I guess we shouldn't. We'll date the podcast.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. Two teams that it's uncertain what their future is.
You like to knock my Jets, and also Jeff Engel, our friend, is a Jets fan too. I don't know how that happened, but.
You know, there are those like you and Jeff who just enjoy suffering and pain and want to live in it, and then there are those like myself who are true historians who love the Yankees and the Packers because they're the historic teams of greatness and are always disappointed that they can't live up to their historical potential.
Well, you know what I say? People ask me, why do you waste your time watching the Jets? I say, everyone needs their soap opera. You know? Some people Some people watch actual soap operas. I watch the New York Jets 3 hours a week, 17 times a year. So.
Oh, my gosh. It's your penance.
Yes. Well, I think I know what I'm going to bring up the next time I speak to Mr. Suri. Did you see that final score from Lambeau Field? His book is Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. On the next episode of History as It Happens, When America Failed the Jews. Ken Burns' new documentary about the U.S. response to the Holocaust is a powerful reminder of what happens when the nations of the world turn their backs on desperate people fleeing persecution. And our guest will be Rebecca Erbelding, who appeared in the PBS special and who is an expert on this subject at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum right here in Washington. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.